All right, hi everybody. Welcome to our first lecture of Biology 1260 for the summer term. We're just going to do a very quick and dirty overview of the anatomy of the urinary system here. So we'll talk about the tube histology, very much in line with what you did towards the end of 1160 with getting the different layers with like a mucosal layer and a submucosa and an adventitia and a serosa. All of these things you should have heard from 1160. So we'll just go in and dive right in and get started. So first of all, we'll just go over the urinary system. What are the components of the urinary system? And what we have are, you've got the adrenal gland sitting on top of the kidneys. The kidneys have these tubes coming out of them called the ureters. The ureters are feeding into this storage device called the urinary bladder. And then the urine is removed from the body through the urethra. Okay, so the focus of this series of lectures is predominantly going to be on kidney structure and function. But you should also consider the urinary bladder, which is the storage-like reservoir for urine, plus these three tube-like organs. So there's the paired ureters, there's two ureters, each one coming from the kidney and taking the urine produced in the kidneys and carrying it to the urinary bladder. And then, as I said, the urinary bladder on the other side connects to the urethra, which is the tube through which the urine leaves the body. So let's talk about the kidneys first. The vast majority of this, we're going to be covering the kidneys more than any of the other organs of the urinary system. First of all, to remember, and this picture should hopefully remind you of this, the kidneys are retroperitoneal. And this is a pretty important term, important enough that I will actually write this on the slide here. So, retroperitoneal. Kidneys are retroperitoneal, which means that they are embedded within the posterior body wall of the abdominal pelvic cavity. So they're not peritoneal. Their outer layer is not a serosa. It's not a visceral peritoneum. So it's not contributing to the serous membrane. In fact, it's actually behind or posterior to the peritoneum. So in this case, we would refer to this as retroperitoneal. And as you might recall from Biology 1160, there's a number of digestive organs, for example, that are retroperitoneal. So just looking at the kidneys here, so you can see two kidneys in this retroperitoneal position. You can see that they're largely surrounded by fat. There are three layers to the kidney. The first layer, which is immediately surrounding the kidney, which you can see in white in this picture right here, that's called the renal capsule. The renal capsule is a smooth, transparent sheet of dense irregular connective tissue. It's continuous with the outer coat of the ureter, and its function is to offer protection. And as an additional function, it also helps to hold the shape of the kidney. So that sort of distinctive kidney shape is created by the characteristics of the renal capsule. Okay, so renal capsule is what immediately surrounds the kidney. So it's the most superficial layer, the deepest layer of the kidney. The outer layer of the kidney, I should say. It's dense irregular connective tissue. It's a smooth, transparent sheet. It's continuous with the ureter, and it also is offering protection and holds the shape of the kidney. Surrounding the renal capsule is called the adipose capsule, which you can see in this picture here is this mass of fatty tissue that surrounds the renal capsule. And this helps to protect the kidney from trauma and also hold it in place in the abdominal cavity. And then surrounding this fatty adipose capsule layer is another layer called the renal fascia. The renal fascia consists again of dense irregular connective tissue. And like a lot of these outer layers of structures, its function is to anchor the organ to the surrounding structures in the abdominal wall. Okay, so for each kidney, there are three outer layers. The innermost outer layer is called the renal capsule, which is in white here. Dense irregular connective tissue helps hold the shape of the kidney and offers protection. Surrounded by that is a mass of fatty tissue called the adipose capsule, which protects the kidney from trauma and holds it in place. And then surrounding the adipose capsule is the renal fascia, which is again dense irregular connective tissue and anchors the kidney to the surrounding structures and abdominal wall. Okay, So now let's consider everything inside that fibrous capsule. And by the way, I should mention collectively the renal fascia, the adipose capsule, and the renal capsule all collectively make up this structure called the fibrous capsule. And so now everything within the fibrous capsule, and just to make sure we're clear on this, all that other stuff we were talking about, the renal capsule, the adipose capsule, the renal fascia, etc., are on the surface of the kidney, not on the inside of the kidney. So I want to talk about what's on the inside of the kidney now, and we can just talk our way through this. So first, the sort of lighter region on the most superficial layer of the kidney is called the renal cortex. It's light in color and granular. This is where you're going to find a lot of the nephron components. Next, deep to the cortex is called the renal medulla. The renal medulla is the inner region. It's darker than the renal cortex. It's defined by these cone-shaped structures. So you can see in this cartoon here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of these cone-shaped structures. The cone-shaped structures are called renal pyramids. So you can see in the real picture on the left-hand side here, you can see 1, 2, 3, kind of 4, 5, 6, 7 of those renal pyramids present. The apex of each of those pyramids, so the point in which the pyramids sort of meet together, here, 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 these are called the papilla. So these are called the papilla of the pyramids, or the papillae, I suppose, of the pyramids. It's much harder to see the papillae in the real picture, but you should be able to see in the real picture, but definitely in the cartoon, that these pyramids have these parallel stripes. So all of these lines are kind of running down the pyramid in parallel with one another. These parallel stripes are microscopic urine collecting tubes that are eventually going to form the urine and then send it out to the ureter and out to the bladder and ultimately outside the body. You'll also notice in the cartoon and in the real picture that the renal cortex, in lighter color here, routinely and periodically penetrates into the medullary layer. And that's what separates each of these pyramids. These regions that separate, these invaginations of the renal cortex that separate the pyramids into distinct functional units are referred to as renal columns. So in this picture here, you can see a renal column here, a renal column here, a renal column here, a renal column here, etc. You can see it in the real picture as well. Here's a really clear renal column right there. Here's a really clear renal column right there. Those renal columns, in separating the individual renal pyramids, is separating the kidney into what we'd call lobes. So each kidney has 7 or 8 lobes. In this particular kidney's case, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lobes that are shown, but there is some variability from kidney to kidney. The next place I'd like to identify in the kidney is called the renal pelvis. So this is this area right here where it looks like all of those different renal pyramids are kind of collecting into. The renal pelvis is the portion of the kidney that's continuous with the ureter. So here's the pelvis right here, and you can see it connects continuously with the ureter, which would then, obviously, as I said before, connect to the bladder. So what you can also see is that the branching of the renal pelvis. So here's the renal pelvis right here, and you can see it has a number of different branches coming out of it. Each of the first set of branches are referred to as major calyces. So here's a major calyx, here's a major calyx, here's a major calyx. And then there are additional branches that pop out called minor calyces, which you can see here and here and here. So the renal pelvis, which collects the urine from all the different nephrons, has main branches, which are called major calyces. And then the major calyces have their own branches, which are called minor calyces. So that's what, proximally speaking, the renal pelvis connects to. Distally speaking, the renal pelvis connects to the ureter and takes all that urine that's coming from the kidney and delivers it to the bladder. So again, the basic deal here is that the majority of the action in the kidney, filtration, whatever, it all takes place in the cortex. And then the functioning of the cortex will feed urine into the pyramids, so into the medulla, through the papillae, into the minor calyces, into the major calyces, into the pelvis, and then that urine will then feed into the ureter, send the urine to be stored in the bladder where it can ultimately be ejected from the body. Now, this movement happens unidirectionally. It always happens in the direction of the kidney, through to the ureter, through to the bladder, through to the urethra, and that is carried out unidirectionally by peristaltic contractions of the calyces, so the minor and major calyces, the pelvis, and the ureter combined. So there's all these peristaltic movements, just like what you saw in the digestive system, except now it's happening in the respiratory system. So as a exercise, what I'd like you to be able to do is fill in all of the components of this kidney here. You should be able to label this diagram. And so if you look over here at the various layers of the kidney, we've got our renal capsule, we've got our adipose capsule, we've got our renal fascia. All of those are found over there. They're all collectively make up what's called the fibrous capsule. So if we go back to this diagram here, we can actually start filling this in. So this is the outer layer of the kidney, so this would be the fibrous capsule. Here is the sort of lightly pigmented inner superficial layer of the inside of the kidney, so that's your cortex, your renal cortex. Here is ambiguous depending on how you define it. This looks to me like a pyramid, so we could say this is a pyramid. But of course you could also talk about this being the medulla of the kidney as well. Here what we can see looks to be what I would call maybe a major calyx. But I could also consider you calling it the pelvis. You'll have to sort of talk these through yourself. This and this are the blood vessels that are entering and leaving the kidney. Which one do you think is the smaller one? This one right here. That's your renal vein. This larger blood vessel is your renal artery. This is what I think is the hilum, and then this would be the ureter, obviously. Okay, so those are the various different layers of the kidney. I'll also point out one other region here. You'll notice that there's an indentation, sort of like this little groove on the inside of the kidney through which the renal vein, the renal artery, and the ureter enter and leave. This region, this sort of indentation that all the vessels enter into the kidney is referred to as the hilum, or the renal hilum. And you should be aware of that term as well. So the kidneys connect to the ureter. In terms of functionality, the ureter simply transports urine from the renal pelvis to the bladder. It's also a retroperitoneal organ like the kidney. So again, it's embedded in the posterior wall of the peritoneal cavity. What we have in the ureter is a very similar tissue makeup to what we saw in the trachea, to what we saw in the digestive tract, to what we saw in the blood vessels. In that what you have, and hopefully you can see this from the real picture here, well, you have the inside of the tube, which is the lumen. Then you're going to have this layer right here. You can probably see this layer all the way around the lumen, and that's called your mucosa. Oops. The mucosa is a transitional epithelium with goblet cells. I'll tell you what those things are in a second. You might not have heard of transitional epithelia from 1160, but goblet cells you have heard of. Those are what produce mucus. The reason you need to have mucus in the urinary tract is because urine has quite a large variety of pHs that it has. So the epithelium needs to be protected from the potentially harsh environment created by the acidity or the basic nature of the urine. So there has to be this sort of mucus protection layer in the lumen. Surrounding the mucosa is something called, so this very sort of small layer on the outside surrounding the mucosa is something you might have heard of before too. It's called the lamina propria. And the lamina propria consists of areolar connective tissue. You should know that term from 1260. There is within the lamina propria, within that areolar connective tissue, tons of collagen and elastic fibers, lots of lymphatic tissue. This very, very big layer surrounding the mucosa and the lamina propria, I didn't draw it very well, but you can see it's this very big, thick red layer surrounding the lamina propria and the mucosa. That's referred to as the muscularis. The muscularis consists of inner longitudinal and outer circular layers of smooth muscle. This is actually the opposite arrangement than what you saw in the digestive tract, if you remember from 1160. The distal, or the final 1/3 of the ureter, which interfaces with the bladder, contains a third outer longitudinal layer. When we talk about these layers of smooth muscle in the muscularis of the ureter and also within the bladder, the primary function of these structures is one thing and one thing only, which is peristalsis. Right? And I know you know what peristalsis is from talking about the digestive system. It's the same thing in terms of moving urine through the urinary system. And then finally, surrounding the muscularis, we have this outer layer right here that I'm outlining, and this is referred to as an adventitia, which I spelled very badly on the slide. Sorry about that. So the adventitia consists of areolar connective tissue. It combines with surrounding connective tissue, and its function, like all of the adventitias, is to anchor the organ, in this case the ureter, in place with the surrounding tissues in the posterior body wall. The one term I wasn't sure if you were familiar about was the transitional epithelium that defines the mucosa layer of the ureter. Its transitional epithelium is the predominant type of epithelium found in the urinary system. So it's found within the urinary bladder, it's found within the ureter, and it's found within the urethra as well. It's a little bit different than other epithelial groupings. So if you looked at this, like if we consider this epithelium here, you can see that there's just within one row or one column here, there's multiple layers of cells, and so we know that this is a stratified epithelium. But if you look at the cells themselves, they kind of look cuboidal. So if I was looking at this picture and asking you in 1160 what you thought this was, I would hope you would say cuboidal stratified or stratified cuboidal epithelium. However, if you were to look at this transitional epithelium at another time of day, even in the same person, it would transition into this arrangement. So as we look at this, again, you can still see these cells in a stratified sense. So it's definitely a stratified epithelium. But the cells now are kind of shaped like pancakes. They're squished cells. And so these are now more squamous-looking cells. So how do you describe this epithelium? Sometimes it's a stratified cuboidal epithelium, and then depending on the time of day, it may transition into being a squamous stratified epithelium. And so as a consequence of that, we end up describing this as being called a transitional epithelium. And if you think about what this epithelium is doing, it actually makes a ton of sense. There needs to be a lot of protection in the bladder, but it has to be like at the same time as volume is filling into your bladder, you either need to store it or get rid of it, and you can't be peeing all the time. And so there will be a requirement on your bladder to hold varying amounts of liquid on a daily basis. So there has to be some flexibility in this organ. This is a very different situation than what you saw in the stomach of the digestive system. And the reason for that is because in the digestive system, you're never going to be able to eat enough to fill up your entire stomach, so it's not really a big concern. In terms of urine, you're constantly making urine. Right now, you're making urine. It's not something that just happens once in a while after you have a meal. You're constantly producing urine, and you can't be peeing all day long, so you need to store things, which is why the bladder is important. The key feature of these transitional epithelia, and again, they can stretch a little bit here, is that the epithelium can be relaxed. It can be in this relaxed, unstretched state when the bladder is empty. but it also has the ability to go into a stretched state when the bladder is full. So the key feature of the transitional epithelium is that it's stretchable to accommodate the accumulation of urine throughout the day, without bursting, of course. The ureters, as you can see in this picture here, there's the ureters. They enter into the bladder at what we would call an oblique angle. And the way I would describe it, I'm going to actually draw this a little bit more simply here. So here's the bladder. Okay, and then here's the ureters. Now, the consequence of the ureter entering into the bladder at oblique angles is that you create these little flaps, which I'm going to exaggerate in this drawing here. So the point at which the ureter and the bladder meet create these little flaps right here. And the purpose of these flaps is to act as a valve. So these are actually acting almost like valves in the heart. And so that if the pressure circumstances try to force urine from the bladder out into the ureter, these flaps would swing shut and block the urine from being able to go back up. So this is a way of, even the way that the ureter enters into the bladder creates these flaps in a way to prevent backflow. So just like with other systems, we're seeing approaches being taken by those systems to minimize, or ensure, I should say, ensure that the urine or the blood or the food or whatever is flowing unidirectionally rather than any which way. From a histological standpoint, the bladder is exactly what you have seen in other situations. So we can start over here, and you can see, well, I mean, there's the lumen. I should mention the lumen always. Over here, we have mucosa. The mucosa consists of, just like with the ureter, transitional epithelia and goblet cells. You'll also notice that there's all these crazy little folds in the mucosa here. You might have seen something similar before when you looked at the stomach in 1160, because those are folded into rugae. Would you remember what rugae did in the stomach? They created all these little foldings so that there would be additional space in the stomach and allow it to expand, which is a thing that the bladder has to deal with as well. And of course, it also has the transitional epithelia the bladder does, which allows even more expansibility. Okay, then surrounding the mucosa, you should remember this now, is the lamina propria. And you should also remember that the lamina propria consists of areolar connective tissue. Then in this picture here, you can see this enormous muscle. So this whole area right here is muscle. So this is your muscularis. And you should remember that there are 3 layers of smooth muscle, starting in the distalmost regions of the ureter, but for most of the bladder, there are 3 layers of smooth muscle: longitudinal inner layer, a circular middle layer, and a longitudinal outer layer. So you should be comfortable with that. There's a longitudinal inner layer, circular middle layer, longitudinal outer layer. This circular layer right here is actually going to become the sphincter that controls whether or not urine leaves the bladder into the urethra. Another name for this muscularis is called the detrusor muscle, which is something you'll hear again even in this course. And then the outer layer of the bladder, which you can't see in this picture because it's too far away, is again the adventitia. And the fact that we're calling it an adventitia again implies that the bladder is retroperitoneal. So that consists of areolar connective tissue. Okay. The opening to the urethra. So again, here's our bladder right here, and here's our urethra right here. There's 2 sphincters that are responsible for controlling this. There's one sphincter right here called the internal urethral sphincter. And so this is involuntary, so it's made up of smooth muscle. And then there's a more distal sphincter right here, which is called the external urethral sphincter. And this is a voluntary muscle. And so it's actually skeletal, not smooth muscle here. And again, these muscles are derived from that circular middle layer of the muscularis, or the detrosor level. Another term you might have heard before is called, or you might encounter, is called the trigone. The trigone is this triangular area right here that's created by the combination of 3 points. The 2 points at which the ureter enters into the bladder, right there and right there, and also the opening for the internal urethral orifice, which is right there. So collectively, that makes a triangle. And in subsequent lectures, we will talk about the histology of the urethra. So that's the end of our first mini lecture. So make sure you know all the organs of the urinary system. Make sure you know all those different layers of the outer surface of the kidney. Make sure you know all the inner layers of the kidney, medulla, cortex, calyx, pelvis, etc. Talk about the tissue layers of the ureter, the bladder, and the urethra. And that will be a really good start for the first week of the course. The next lecture coming up will be to talk about the nephron, and we'll start getting into the nitty-gritty of how urine is produced. With that, I bid adieu. See you soon.